This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
In the name of God, amen. Please. Last Sunday it was sour grapes. This Sunday it's wild grapes. Grapes, grapes. It's harvest time. What can we say? These are two stories that obviously go hand in hand. At some levels, the gospel parable is a quoting of that story from, that love song, actually, from Isaiah. And it's important for us to hear and remember that we are the beloved of God. Throughout these stories, we are the beloved of God. Even Paul, writing to the Philippians, talks about us being the beloved of God. It's important for us to hear that and live into that. The stories are not rocket science in terms of what is being said, but there are a couple of things that I would preface my sermon with. First and foremost, that bit about inheritance. In first century Palestine, if there was no heir to inherit property, it was legitimate for tenants or slaves to claim that land and to be given that inheritance. That's number one. Second thing, this could be a great stewardship lesson. I'm not going there today, only a little bit. The third thing is, the vineyard is not ours. The vineyard is not ours. The vineyard is God's. The vineyard is God's. And we are called to tend the field and to produce the fruits of the kingdom: righteousness, grace, those things that unite us in community. But where I want to look today is at the violence that is a part of this story. We make an assumption that it was back then and violence was a part of life. It does not take too much intelligence to pick up the newspaper, to turn on the television, to hear the news in some form, that violence is still a part of our world. And the reality that we do participate in that violence and perpetuate that violence at numerous levels. Violence, broad strokes. Violence can take many forms. The smart comment, we think, that is cutting to someone else. Gay, straight, black, white, male, female. It happens in a variety of ways. This morning, the class about Judaism, or about Islam, talked about the role of women within Islam. One of the things that I did for about 10 years before I retired was to be the lead teacher in the Diocese of Los Angeles, dealing with misconduct issues. And one of the things that I learned in the process of preparing for that class and teaching that throughout the diocese was that some of the things we knew, it is an issue of power. It is about power most often. But part of where that also originates is a remembering that it has only been within the last, give or take, 80 years that women and children were regarded as property in this country, in a variety of states. Violence is abuse. Violence is around us. What's the most popular video game out there right now? Angry Birds. And we pop them off. It's a travesty to me that what used to be about young people learning athletics, whether it be soccer or football or baseball, is now become this let's get 'em, let's win at any cost, let's trip the other person on intentionally, let's be in power. Violence. We are surrounded by it in our society. There's all kinds of violence. We can talk, if you will, about terrorism. We can talk about the great hoopla on Friday about the death of another terrorist, and the extra hoopla that was raised over Ron Paul saying he was an American citizen. We put somebody to death without a trial. Now we can go all kinds of places with that. But violence surrounds us. And yet what we are called to be about is those who are sent into the harvest, into the vineyard, God's vineyard, and to nurture and care and cultivate and do all those sorts of things for God's kingdom, for the upbuilding of God's kingdom. Most of the world, and even some denominations, would say that the story ends with the cross. We, on the other hand, say that it ends with resurrection, new life, grace, and the power of love. Violence around us, in the vineyard. All those things are a part of our calling. This past week, I happened to go to Jan Richardson's blog, The Painted Prayer Book, and she introduced me to a Jewish woman who lived at the same time as Anne Frank in the Netherlands and who died at Auschwitz at age 29. She was an amazing young woman who kept journals and diaries, as did Anne Frank. A little older, a little more mature. Her name was Esther Hilsum, or known as Eddie Hilsum. And somehow she figured out, in the midst of the horror that was happening, that that was not God's plan. And so her journals were finally discovered in the early 80s, published first in the Netherlands in Dutch and published in Dutch in 1981, and finally translated into English in 1983. But she made some very profound statements in those journals. First is, never give up. Never escape taking everything in, and perhaps suffering. That's not too awful either, but never, never give up. And another one should want to be a balm on many wounds. So this young Jewish woman who was killed in the Holocaust, Eddie persisted in tending her soul as the world was falling apart around her. She understood that violence doesn't spring forth fully formed, that it gestates in small acts and individuals' hearts. And then when we don't attend to what's going on inside of us, the destructiveness within us accumulates and spills over into the world around us. Shortly after appearing at a Gestapo hall where she and other Jewish people had been summoned for questioning, Eddie wrote in her journal, "Something else about this morning, the perception, very strongly borne in, that despite all the suffering and injustice, I cannot hate others. All the appalling things that happen are no mysterious threats from afar, but arise from fellow beings very close to us. That makes these happenings more familiar, then and not so frightening. The terrifying thing is that systems grow too big for men and hold them in a satanic grip. The builders no less than the victims of the system. Much as large edifices and spires, created by men's hands, tower higher above us, dominate us, yet may collapse over our heads and bury us." One of the practices that Eddie cultivated in the midst of the Holocaust was a refusal to give in to hatred. She recognized hatred as a form of violence that would not solve the terror that the Nazis were inflicting. "I see no alternative," she once told a friend. "Each of us must turn inward and destroy in himself all that he thinks he ought to destroy in others." 66 years ago this week, Eddie wrote in her journal, "Ultimately, we have just one moral duty: to reclaim large areas of peace in ourselves, more and more peace, and reflect it toward others. And the more peace there is in us, the more peace there will also be in our troubled world." The challenge for us, as it was for her, this peace thing, especially since it specifically does not mean refusing to see the violence that persists in the world or pretending it isn't there. It doesn't mean being spineless, doesn't mean letting the bullies win, doesn't mean standing by while others are destroyed. Whatever peace doesn't mean, I do know it includes seeking it within our own selves, cultivating it in the vineyard of our own souls, recognizing that what grows there is intertwined with what grows in the world beyond our borders. So how do we cultivate our souls and cultivate God's kingdom and cultivate God's vineyard? Amen.